Good day. This video presents an informative analysis of the complex Chinese regional conflicts in the Asia-Pacific, focusing specifically on Taiwan and the Philippines. Understanding these tensions is crucial for grasping the broader implications for regional stability and international relations. The Asia-Pacific region has historically been a focal point for geopolitical dynamics, and recent developments have intensified the focus on China. The rise of the Chinese dragon signifies not only economic growth but also a resurgence of military assertiveness. This awakening is evident in the increasing frequency of Chinese incursions into waters claimed by Taiwan and the Philippines. These actions represent a significant challenge to the established order maintained by the United States and its allies for decades. The mutual defense systems established by the U.S. have traditionally served as a deterrent against aggression in the region. However, as China expands its influence, the effectiveness of these systems is increasingly questioned. Taiwan, a self-governing democracy, stands at the forefront of this struggle. Its strategic location and vibrant economy make it a focal point for both Chinese ambitions and American interests. In recent years, Taiwan has faced heightened military tensions with China. The Chinese government views Taiwan as a breakaway province and has not ruled out the use of force to achieve reunification. This perspective has led to an increase in military exercises near Taiwan, with Chinese fighter jets frequently breaching Taiwan's air defense identification zone. The situation remains precarious, with a significant potential for miscalculation. Similarly, the Philippines confronts its own territorial disputes in the South China Sea. As a longtime ally of the United States, the Philippines relies on its mutual defense treaty with America as a cornerstone of its national security strategy. However, as China asserts its claims over vast portions of the South China Sea, including areas that the Philippines considers its own, the country faces a challenging dilemma. The Philippine government must navigate the delicate balance of maintaining its alliance with the U.S. while addressing the realities of Chinese aggression. The international community is closely monitoring these developments. The United States has reaffirmed its commitment to defending Taiwan and has increased military cooperation with the Philippines. Joint military exercises and arms sales are part of the strategy to enhance the defense capabilities of these nations. However, the effectiveness of these measures in deterring Chinese aggression remains uncertain. International law plays a critical role in this dynamic. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea provides a framework for maritime disputes, but enforcement poses challenges. China has often disregarded international rulings, such as the 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration decision that favored the Philippines in its territorial claims. This disregard for international norms complicates the situation and raises concerns about the rule of law in the region. In response to these challenges, Taiwan and the Philippines are exploring various strategies to protect their territorial interests. Diplomatic efforts are underway to strengthen alliances and garner support from other nations. The Quad, comprising the U.S., Japan, India, and Australia, is one initiative aimed at countering China's influence in the Indo-Pacific. These nations recognize the importance of a free and open Indo-Pacific and are committed to upholding international law. Public sentiment in Taiwan and the Philippines significantly influences responses to Chinese incursions. In Taiwan, a growing sense of national identity and resistance to Chinese pressure has led to increased support for maintaining the status quo. In the Philippines, public opinion is divided, with some advocating for a stronger stance against China.
Okay.
He was seen as pretty friendly with China.
Pro-China, some would say.
Yeah, and some argue that actually emboldened China.
I can see that.
But now, under President Marcos Jr.,
Okay.
there's been a shift.
What kind of shift?
They're trying to build stronger ties with the U.S.
Oh, interesting.
and other Western allies.
So it's like a pivot away from China?
Yeah, it's a rebalancing act.
Makes sense.
You know,
They're trying to find their footing.
Yeah, and one of the most visible signs of this shift
Oh, yeah.
is the expansion of joint military drills with the U.S.
You mean like war games?
Yeah, they're called Bellicaton.
What's that mean?
It means shoulder to shoulder.
Oh, wow. That's powerful.
It is.
sends a message
She does.
like, hey, we've got backup.
But we're not alone.
Yeah, exactly.
We're not alone in this.
What else are they doing?
Well, they've also expanded this thing called the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement.
What a mouthful.
Yeah, EDCA.
Okay, EDCA, what's that?
This agreement gives the U.S. access to Philippine military bases.
Oh, wow. So they're really stepping up their cooperation.
They are, and under Marcos Jr., they've added 4 more bases.
Or more. Wow.
It's a clear signal.
To China, like, don't mess with us.
Right.
But it's not just about what's happening externally.
No.
There's a whole internal debate
Oh, absolutely.
within the Philippines about how to handle this.
Yeah, it's not a simple, like, pick a side situation.
There are a lot of different perspectives.
There are different voices, different concerns.
So it's not just black and white. There's a lot of gray area.
Yeah, it's complicated.
I bet.
And I think it's important to explore those internal struggles.
To understand the full picture.
Yeah, because the Philippines is in a tough spot,
No doubt.
trying to balance their own interests with these,
External pressures
external pressure.
from both sides.
Yeah.
It's a tough situation for sure.
It is.
Yeah, it's like they're caught between a rock and a hard place.
And, they've got people like Manuel Mamba.
Who's he?
He's the governor of Cagayan province.
Okay.
And he's actually pretty worried about these new U.S. bases
Why is that?
because his province is close to Taiwan.
Ah.
And
wow.
he's worried that if things get worse, his province could become a battleground.
That's a valid concern.
Yeah, he's thinking about the safety of his people
Of course.
and the economic impact, too.
Right, because war is bad for business.
Exactly. So it's not an easy decision.
No, it's a real dilemma.
And then you have student activists.
Okay,
Like
interesting.
Rans, Jules, and Ariel.
What are they saying?
Well, they're critical of both China's actions
Okay.
and the increased U.S. military presence.
So they're not on either side.
They're kind of like, we need a different way.
A third way.
Yeah, a third way.
Interesting.
And they're using platforms like TikTok to get their message out there.
TikTok, huh?
Yeah, they're talking about human rights violations.
Which is a big concern, especially with the Philippines' history with U.S. military involvement.
Right, it's not a perfect track record.
No, not at all.
So it's understandable that they're worried.
Yeah, they're trying to find a solution that works for everyone.
But it's a tough situation
It is.
because they're up against these powerful forces.
It's David versus Goliath.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's interesting.
What?
This conflict with China has kind of brought the Philippines together.
Yeah, there's a sense of national unity.
Like they're all facing this threat together.
It's like a common enemy.
Exactly.
And this Atinito movement,
Let's say.
it's this citizen-led initiative. It means this is ours.
I like that.
It's all about supporting the Filipino fishermen
Okay.
and advocating for the Philippines' rights in the South China Sea.
So it's a way for people to stand up and say,
This is our territory.
we're not backing down.
Exactly. And they're doing things like there was this event
Oh, yeah.
with Senator Risa Hontiveros.
Okay. No.
She's a big opposition figure.
Right.
And she went to this fishing village called Masinloc. Okay.
For an At and Edo event.
So she's supporting the movement.
Yeah. And she stood there in front of all these fishermen.
Who have been harassed by Chinese forces.
Right. And she told them,
What'd she say?
the government is behind you.
Wow, that's a powerful message.
It was.
Like, we're all in this together.
Yeah. And what's really cool is that she actually recognized Tufonis.
The fisherman we were talking about.
Yeah. The one who testified at The Hague.
And she thanked him.
She did. She thanked him for his courage.
That's awesome.
So it's this moment of like,
Solidarity.
yeah, like we're all in this fight together.
It's pretty inspiring.
It is. And this unified front is really important for the Philippines
Why is that?
because it gives them more leverage
Okay.
when they're dealing with China.
I see, like a stronger bargaining position.
Yeah. And then you have things like the proposed maritime zones bill
Oh, yeah? What's that about?
that's trying to formally enforce that tribunal's decision.
So they're actually putting it into law. Yeah, and clarifying the Philippines' maritime boundaries.
That's a bold move.
It is. It's sending a message.
To China. Like,
Yeah.
we're serious.
Yeah, we're not playing around.
But that could provoke them.
It could.
It's a risky move.
It is. But even with all of this,
The unity in the legal rulings.
the situation is still really tense.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
You have Chinese ships constantly around Philippine-claimed islands.
Like they're just lurking,
They are.
waiting for something to happen.
And there was that incident with the water cannons
Oh, I read about that.
where they were used against Filipino sailors.
That's scary.
Yeah, it's a dangerous game.
And then you have the Sierra Madre.
The Sierra
Those-
Madre.
That World War II ship
Yeah, that they intentionally grounded.
as a symbol of resistance.
Yeah, it's become this, like, icon.
China wants them to remove it.
Oh, yeah, they're not happy about it.
They've been blocking resupply missions, using water cannons, even threatening to tow it away.
It's become a real flashpoint.
The symbol of the whole conflict.
And it's brought us to this really important point.
What's that?
The U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty.
Ah, that's the big one.
President Marcos Jr. has said that he's ready to use it
If what?
if any Filipino serviceman is killed in an attack.
Wow, that's a big statement.
It is. It's basically
I
saying
don't even think about it.
to China.
Yeah. Or else?
So it's a huge risk.
It is.
Yeah.
Because what if China calls their bluff?
Right. What if they do attack?
Then what?
Then we could have a war.
It's a scary thought.
It is. And it's a reminder that this is a really delicate situation.
The Philippines is walking a tightrope
Trying to deter China.
without starting a war.
Yeah. It's a tough balancing act.
It is, and it's not clear how it's all going to play out.
Yeah, it's a high wire act for sure.
It really is.
But one thing the Philippines has been doing well
Oh,
is using media and publicity
Yeah.
to their advantage.
How so?
Yeah.
It's like,
The best defense is a good offense.
yeah. That's
So what are they doing?
They're sharing footage?
Oof. Of these confrontations, like the water cannon incident,
Oh, yeah.
they're inviting journalists on these trips to the islands.
To see it firsthand.
Yeah, and it's working.
It is.
It's getting international attention.
I see. They're getting their story out there.
Yeah, and China doesn't like it
Why not?
because it makes them look bad.
It does.
Especially when you see these videos
Like that one.
with the Chinese Coast Guard ship.
Tailing the tourists and journalists.
It went viral.
Yeah, I saw that one.
And the Sierra Madre.
Oh, yeah, the grounded ship.
It's become this.
Media magnet.
Every time something happens there.
The whole world is watching.
And the Philippines is smart.
How so?
They're using this attention to highlight China's bullying tactics.
Yeah, it's making China look like the aggressor.
And it's getting people on their side.
I see. It's a smart strategy.
It's like David versus Goliath.
Using media to level the playing field.
Exactly.
But even with all the media attention,
It doesn't change the fact that,
they're outmatched militarily.
yeah, the Philippines is still at a disadvantage.
So what can they do?
Their hope lies in the U.S.
The alliance.
Yeah, at that mutual defense treaty.
But even that's not a guarantee.
You're right, there are no guarantees.
It's a complex situation.
It is. And internally,
Yeah, we can't forget about that.
President Marcos Jr. has inherited this really complex political landscape.
Shaped by Duterte's pro-China stance,
He's got to unify his people.
while dealing with pressure from both sides.
Yeah, it's like walking a tightrope.
And then there's Duterte's daughter,
The vice president.
a potential future president.
What if she brings back that pro-China stance?
It's a possibility.
It adds another layer of uncertainty.
It does.
So the future of the South China Sea.
It's up in the air.
Yeah, so many factors at play.
It's overwhelming to think about.
It is, but what are some key takeaways
From all of this,
for our listeners?
I think the South China Sea conflict is a microcosm of what the world is facing today. Rising nationalism,
Yeah.
shifting power dynamics, this erosion of the rules-based order.
That we've all agreed to.
Exactly. And the struggle to find peaceful solutions.
To really complex problems.
Yeah, and we've only scratched the surface.
We've explored the human cost,
the difficult choices.
the global implications.
But there's always more to learn.
So keep researching.
Stay informed.
Talk about it.
Because understanding these challenges
Is the first step towards
something solutions.
It's a story that's still being written.
And we're all part of it.
And the choices we make
Will shape the future.
of the region.
And maybe even the world.
So until next time.
Keep diving deep.
And remember,
Even amidst all this uncertainty.
there's always more to learn.
And discover.
And we'll see you next time. All right, ready to dive in? Today we're tackling Chinese foreign policy, specifically under Xi Jinping.
The big one.
It is. And we've got this academic paper, China's Foreign Policy in Xi's Era, Change and Continuity to Guide Us.
Sounds intriguing.
Right. So imagine you're prepping for, like, a high-stakes meeting, international players, or maybe you're just, like, super curious about how China's actions are impacting the world. Well,
I mean, China's a big player these days. Everyone's got to understand them.
exactly. And that's what this deep dive is all about. It's your cheat sheet to understanding how China's moving on the global stage.
So, is China changing its game plan or sticking to the old one? That's the big question, right?
That's what this paper digs into. It's a juicy one. Now, we can't ignore the fact that China's become an economic powerhouse.
Oh, yeah. They've been making waves for a while now.
Seriously, from 2009 to 2016, they were the world's biggest exporter and the second largest importer.
Wow, that's a lot of goods moving around.
Right, and they're the top trading partner for so many countries in Asia, the Middle East, Africa. It's huge.
So the question is, how does all that economic muscle translate into political influence?
And what does it mean for the rest of us?
Exactly. That's a million-dollar question.
Okay, so we've got this economic giant on the scene, and then comes Xi Jinping.
He's definitely made his mark, hasn't he?
Oh, yeah. The paper kind of paints him as a key figure, saying his leadership marks a shift from that keeping a low profile thing we saw before.
Right. It's like he's saying, hey, China's here, and we're not afraid to show it.
Exactly. I mean, just look at his diplomatic activity. In his first 5 years, 28 state visits across 5 continents.
That's a lot of travel.
Yeah, and he's hosted all these international summits in China, BRICS, Belt and Road Forum, you name it.
So is it just a more assertive style, or is he fundamentally changing how China operates on the world stage?
It's a good question. The paper delves into that. But to really understand Xi Jinping's game plan, we got to decode his foreign policy thinking.
Okay,
He's got these concepts like new type of major country relations, new type of international relations.
And let's not forget, a community of shared future for mankind.
Yeah, that one's a mouthful.
It is, but it's important.
Yeah.
These ideas have real-world consequences, like how China deals with other countries, trade deals, global challenges.
They sound a bit abstract.
They do, but they boil down to this. No conflict, everyone wins through cooperation. Forget that zero-sum game mentality.
Interesting. So it's all about finding common ground, working together.
Yeah, and embracing multilateralism.
Yeah.
Working together with lots of different countries.
Okay, makes sense. But let's get practical for a second.
Sure, let's do it.
We got to talk about the elephant in the room. The Belt and Road Initiative.
That's a big one, literally.
It is this massive infrastructure project stretching across Eurasia and Africa. And, those areas are super strategically important in geopolitical thought.
Yeah, the heartland, rimland, all that jazz.
Exactly. So some people are saying it's a win-win for development, while others are worried it's like a way for China to dominate.
A lot of different perspectives on that one.
For sure. Now, the paper makes an interesting point.
Go on.
They argue the Belt and Road is all about connectivity and cooperation, not political or military expansion.
So it's about building roads, railways, ports, that kind of stuff.
Exactly, to make trade and investment easier.
But, it's hard not to wonder if there's more to it.
Right. A rising power pouring resources into these strategically important regions, it's bound to raise eyebrows.
For sure. And to really understand why people are skeptical, we got to zoom in on China's economy.
Okay, so what's going on internally?
Well, China's economic growth has slowed down a bit. It's still impressive, but not what it used to be. They call it the new normal.
I've heard that term.
Yeah, and it's led to all these internal reforms, making their markets more dynamic, pushing innovation, opening up sectors like services.
So are they trying to address this slowdown through the Belt and Road Initiative? Finding new markets, bridging the gap between China's East and West?
That's one way to look at it. It's about creating opportunities beyond their borders.
I see. So with all this in mind, the paper says Xi Jinping's foreign policy is marked by both change and continuity.
Okay, so what's changing and what's staying the same?
Well, the continuity is their commitment to independent foreign policy and peaceful development. They still want a stable world for their economic growth.
Just like their predecessors.
Exactly. But the change is in their approach.
How does that?
They're way more proactive and assertive now. They're shaping global conversations and flexing their muscles in those multilateral institutions.
So they're not content to sit on the sidelines anymore.
Nope, they're stepping up, making their voices heard.
It's like they're saying, we're here and we're ready to play ball, but on our terms.
I like that. Okay, so we've covered the basics. China's economic rise, Xi Jinping's leadership style, the Belt and Road. It's a lot.
It is. And we've only just scratched the surface.
True. Now let's unpack those mind-boggling concepts Xi Jinping has introduced.
Okay, those are some head-scratchers.
They are. This is where things get really interesting.
I'm ready. What's first on the list?
Let's start with...
Let's dive into that new type of major country relations thing.
Okay, break it down for me.
So it's basically like a framework for how big powers, like China and the U.S., should interact.
Right. Those two are always in the spotlight.
Yeah. And the idea is to avoid conflict, respect each other's core interests, and find areas where they can both benefit from cooperation.
So instead of that, traditional rivalry, power struggles, they're aiming for more of a team effort.
Exactly. It's about finding common ground, working together instead of against each other.
That sounds good in theory, but in practice, I don't know.
Yeah, some people are skeptical, for sure.
I mean, there's always going to be tension between countries like China and the U.S., right?
Absolutely. And those critics point to things like, trade disputes, disagreements over technology, security issues.
Yeah, all that stuff is still happening. It's hard to just, flip a switch and be best buddies.
Right. So there's definitely healthy skepticism about whether this new type of relationship can really work.
Okay, so that's major country relations. What about the new type of international relations? Is that just a bigger version of the same idea?
Kind of, but it goes beyond just the big players. It's about making the whole global system more inclusive.
So bringing more countries to the table.
Exactly. And it's about moving away from those zero-sum games where one country wins at the expense of another.
Right, because in today's world, everyone's connected, and those global challenges need everyone on board to solve them.
Exactly. We can't just have a few powerful nations calling the shots anymore.
It's got to be a team effort. Okay, so that's the new type of international relations. Now, what about that community of shared future for mankind? That one's always intrigued me.
Yeah, that's Xi Jinping's big vision, his, ultimate goal for how the world should work.
It sounds pretty utopian, almost like something out of Star Trek.
It does have that idealistic ring to it, but at its core, it's about recognizing that we're all interconnected.
Especially when it comes to things like climate change, pandemics, economic instability.
Exactly. These are global problems that require global solutions.
No country can handle that stuff alone.
Right. And that's where the community of shared future idea comes in. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together.
Shared responsibility, shared benefits.
Exactly. But the big question is, how do you actually put that into practice?
Right. It's easy to talk about a community of shared future, but building one is a whole different ballgame.
And that's where things like the Belt and Road come in.
So they're trying to make that vision a reality through these concrete projects.
Some see it that way, yeah. At least on a regional level. It's about fostering closer ties between countries through infrastructure, trade, investment.
But we got to remember those concerns about debt traps, environmental damage, and, China potentially using it to their own advantage.
Those concerns are valid, for sure. China's looking out for their own interests, just like any other country.
So it's a balancing act, trying to advance your own goals while also contributing to the greater good.
Exactly. And speaking of advancing goals, the paper highlights how China's trying to shape the global narrative.
Oh yeah, they're not just playing the game anymore, they're trying to rewrite the rules.
Right. They're becoming much more proactive in promoting their own perspectives on the world stage.
So it's not just about economic and political power, it's about the power of ideas and narratives.
Precisely. They're realizing that soft power matters, shaping perceptions and influencing how the world sees them.
And that's especially important when you're competing with a country like the U.S.
Absolutely. It's not just a clash of economies and militaries, it's also a battle of ideologies and worldviews.
Because China's promoting their own model, right? State-led capitalism, social stability, strong central government.
Yeah, and they're contrasting that with what they see as the weaknesses of Western-style democracy.
Pointing to things like the financial crisis, political polarization.
Right, it's like they're saying, look, our system works, and it might have some lessons for you.
Interesting. So they're not explicitly trying to export their model, but they're definitely putting it on display.
Exactly. And it's resonating with some countries, especially in the developing world.
So we've gone from this grand vision of a community of shared future to the nitty-gritty of competing development models and the battle for hearts and minds.
It's a fascinating mix of big ideas and practical realities.
And it shows how complex and ambitious China's foreign policy is under Xi Jinping.
Absolutely. We can't just rely on simplistic interpretations anymore. We got to dig deeper, understand their motivations and strategies.
Because China's choices are going to impact all of us.
No doubt about it. Their growing power and influence mean that their decisions have global consequences.
So understanding their foreign policy isn't just an academic exercise. It's essential for navigating the 21st century.
Exactly. It's about understanding the forces shaping our world and being prepared for what's coming next.
Okay, so before we move on, there's one more thing we got to cover. China's role in those multilateral institutions.
The UN, WTO, IMF, all that.
Yeah, they've been members for a while, but it seems like under Xi Jinping, they're stepping up their game.
Oh yeah, they're not just passive participants anymore.
It's like they're saying, we're here to shape the agenda, not just follow it.
Exactly. They want a bigger say in global governance, a seat at the table where the rules are made.
Makes sense. They're a major player now. They want to act like it.
Right. And we see this in their efforts to reform existing institutions and also in their creation of new ones, like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank.
The AIIB, that was a big deal.
It was. Some people saw it as a direct challenge to, the U.S.-led world order.
It's like China's creating their own system, one that reflects their vision.
Definitely raised some eyebrows in Washington and other Western capitals.
So how has China responded to those criticisms? Because it's hard not to see the AIIB as a power move.
They've said all along that it's not about undermining existing institutions, but about complementing them, offering alternative financing for development.
Especially in Asia, where there's a huge need for infrastructure.
Exactly. They're saying, look, there's a gap, and we're filling it.
But even if they're being sincere, there's no denying China's becoming more assertive.
Absolutely. Whether it's through the AIIB or the Belt and Road, they're making their presence felt.
And that raises some big questions.
Like, what's their ultimate goal? Do they want to reshape the global order in their own image? Or are they willing to work within the existing system, even if they want to tweak it a bit?
It feels like we're at a turning point. The old order is being challenged, and China's right there leading the charge.
So where's it all headed? A more multipolar world where power is spread out? Or are we moving towards a new kind of bipolarity with China and the U.S. as the two main poles?
It's a tough question.
No easy answers. But the trajectory of China's foreign policy under Xi Jinping is definitely one of those important things happening in the world today.
It's shaping the 21st century.
We need to understand it if we want to navigate the challenges and opportunities that are coming our way.
Well said. Okay, so we've covered a lot in this deep dive. Xi Jinping's foreign policy concepts, the Belt and Road, China's role in global governance.
It's a complex landscape, and we've only just begun to explore it.
True, but we've laid a good foundation for understanding China's ambitions and strategies.
And now, I think it's time to shift our focus inward, to those domestic factors that are shaping China's actions on the world stage.
Okay, let's connect the dots between what's happening inside China and how they're acting globally.
Because those internal dynamics are crucial for understanding why China's making the choices they're making.
Let's do it. It's interesting, as we've been unpacking all this, one thing that keeps coming back to me is how connected China's foreign policy is to what's happening domestically.
Yeah, it's not just about projecting power outward. It's about managing those internal pressures, keeping things stable at home.
Exactly. It's like two sides of the same coin. You can't separate China's foreign policy from what's going on inside the country.
Right, they're completely intertwined.
Like we talked about that new normal of slower economic growth, and the paper suggests that's actually driven some of China's foreign policy moves, like the Belt and Road, as a way to find new markets and keep that economic engine going.
It makes sense. The Belt and Road is presented as this global initiative, but it also serves a domestic purpose.
Right. It's about addressing those internal economic imbalances, creating opportunities for their companies, their workers.
It's a clever strategy, tackling multiple challenges at once.
And that push for innovation, made in China 2025, that's connected to both domestic and foreign policy goals, right?
Oh, absolutely. China sees technological advancement as key to their economic competitiveness and national security.
They want to be a leader in those cutting-edge fields, like AI, 5G, biotech.
And that's putting them head-to-head with the U.S., sparking that trade war and that competition for tech dominance.
It's like what's happening internally spills over into their foreign policy and creates these ripple effects across the globe.
It's a good example of how those domestic pressures can shape global events.
Speaking of internal pressures, we got to talk about nationalism. It feels like it's playing a bigger role under Xi Jinping.
Yeah, you're right. He's definitely tapped into a sense of national pride and historical grievance, especially around China's century of humiliation.
That period where China was exploited by foreign powers, it's a powerful narrative.
It is, and it resonates deeply with the Chinese people.
It's like they're saying, we're not going to be pushed around anymore.
Exactly. There's this newfound confidence, a sense that China's reclaiming its rightful place in the world.
And that's got to be influencing their foreign policy decisions.
It is, for sure. We're seeing a more assertive, even confrontational approach, especially towards countries seen as challenging their core interests.
Like Taiwan or those involved in the South China Sea disputes.
Right, those are red lines for China.
So it's clear those internal dynamics, from economic shifts to this surge in nationalism, they're having a huge impact on how China's acting on the world stage.
It's all connected. And it reminds us that foreign policy is never just about, abstract geopolitical maneuvering.
It's about the hopes, fears, and aspirations of real people.
And in China, with its massive population and growing influence, those hopes and fears have the power to reshape the world.
It's a powerful thought. As China continues to grow economically and militarily, the big question is how they'll use that power.
It's the question that's shaping the 21st century. No easy answers, but conversations like this help us understand the forces at play, grapple with the implications.
The more we understand about China's foreign policy, the better prepared we'll be for what's coming.
Absolutely. So on that note, I think we've done a pretty good job unpacking China's foreign policy in the Xi Jinping era.
We've covered a lot of ground, explored those key concepts, delved into the motivations and strategies.
It's a complex and ever-evolving landscape.
But we've given our listeners a solid foundation for understanding this crucial topic.
And we've encouraged them to keep digging, to explore those sources, and draw their own conclusions.
Because China's story is still being written, and its impact on the world will only grow.
It's a journey worth following. So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
See you on the next deep dive.
Taiwan, it's been in the news a lot lately. And today we're going to do a deep dive into why it's such a geopolitical hotspot.
Oh, yeah. It's definitely a place to watch.
We're going to be checking out this DW News video. It's called Why China and the U.S. Are So Obsessed with Taiwan Mapped Out.
Oh, that's a good one. I saw that one, too.
Yeah, it has a ton of good expert commentary from both the U.S. and China, which,
Yeah, you need both sides.
you need both sides to get, the full picture.
Exactly.
The first thing that, struck me when watching it was that map of Taiwan.
Oh, my gosh.
It's only 80 miles from mainland China.
It's so close.
And then they show footage of Chinese military drills, and they're basically practicing to encircle the entire island.
I know, it's kind of scary.
It's pretty chilling.
Yeah, just that visual of how close it is and the power dynamic right there.
Yeah.
And to understand China's perspective, you really have to look back at their history.
Okay.
The Chinese Civil War in the late 1940s ended with the communists taking control of mainland China, and the nationalists fled to Taiwan. And so that's how you ended up with two governments claiming to be the real China.
Ah, so that's where that comes from.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's kind of like this historical wound that never quite healed,
Yeah.
and now it's like a global flashpoint.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it.
But Taiwan's importance goes way beyond just history, too.
Oh, for sure.
It's really strategic, just geographically.
Absolutely.
Can you talk a little more about that?
So, just think about maritime traffic.
Okay.
Taiwan is right smack in the middle of three super important straits.
Okay.
The Taiwan Strait, the Miyako Strait, and the Bashi Strait.
And these are not just random waterways.
No. They are major shipping routes
Oh, wow.
for global trade. And the video actually points out that almost all the world's largest container ships pass through the Taiwan Strait.
Whoa, it's a lot of ships.
It's a lot of cargo. It
Yeah.
really makes you realize how everything is connected.
Yeah.
So if there were a conflict there,
Oh, gosh, yeah.
it would disrupt global trade big time.
For every...
Yeah, potentially.
Both the U.S. and China rely on these straits for their own trade.
Right, and any disruption
Yeah.
could have huge economic consequences.
Makes sense.
There's a Chinese expert featured in the video, Victor Gao, and he makes a really interesting point.
Okay, what's that?
He says that Taiwan literally interrupts the continuity of the Chinese coastline,
Oh, wow.
and it blocks their access to the Pacific Ocean. So from China's perspective,
Yeah.
it's like this barrier in their way
I see.
that's preventing them from being a dominant maritime power.
It's like they're boxed in.
Kinda, yeah. And of course, the U.S. is trying to counter that.
Yeah, that's where the first island chain comes into play, right?
Exactly. That's their strategy.
I've heard that term, but what is that exactly?
So basically, it's a chain of U.S. military bases that stretch from Japan all the way down to the Philippines,
Ah.
with Taiwan right in the middle.
Oh, right in the middle.
It's essentially a way for the U.S. to project power and to contain China's influence. And the video actually shows a map of all these bases, and it makes it pretty clear what the U.S. is trying to do.
Okay, so it's almost like a geopolitical chess match then.
Yeah, and the stakes are super high
Yeah.
because these straits are not just for trade.
Right.
They're essential for, like, naval power projection.
I can see how that would get really tense.
Oh, yeah. And the video actually shows footage of U.S. and Philippine troops doing military exercises.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and they even sink an old Chinese ship.
Oh, wow.
So it's pretty much a clear message to Beijing that the U.S. is serious about defending their interests there.
It's interesting how China views Taiwan almost as this obstacle,
Yeah.
but there's this deeper historical and ideological angle to it all, too.
Yeah, definitely.
Like the whole national rejuvenation concept.
Yeah.
What does that even mean exactly?
So the video goes into this idea of the century of humiliation, which was this period in Chinese history full of foreign invasions and internal struggles.
Wow.
And it's this powerful narrative that continues to fuel this resentment
I see.
and this desire to restore China's former glory. There's this one image that really stood out to me.
What was that?
They show this caricature of China being carved up by foreign powers.
Oh, God.
And it just drives home the point that Xi Jinping sees retaking Taiwan as central to this national rejuvenation project.
Wow, so for China, it's about way more than just territory then.
Yeah, it's about righting historical wrongs
Wow.
and reclaiming their rightful place on the world stage.
It's almost like it's built into their national identity at this point.
Totally. And it's intertwined with Xi Jinping's vision of China's future.
Yeah.
The video even includes a quote from Xi Jinping himself,
Oh, really?
where he states that no one can block the reunification of China,
Wow.
peaceful or otherwise.
Oh, wow. That's pretty strong language.
Yeah, he's serious.
So it sounds like he's really drawing a line in the sand there.
Absolutely.
But what about the Taiwanese people?
That's a good question.
Where do they fit into all of this?
That's what we're going to talk about next. It's easy to get lost in all the military talk and the politics.
Yeah,
But, there are 23 million people who actually live in Taiwan,
that's true.
each with their own story.
Right. It's easy to forget about the human side of things when we're talking about, geopolitics.
Exactly.
What does the video tell us about what life is like for everyday people in Taiwan?
Well, Taiwan has developed into a really thriving democracy.
Mm.
They were the first in Asia to legalize same-sex marriage,
Wow.
which, highlights the difference in values compared to mainland China.
Yeah, that's a pretty stark contrast.
It is.
You got this vibrant democracy right on China's doorstep.
Yeah.
I imagine that creates some tension.
Oh, definitely. And the video does a good job capturing that sense of uncertainty that a
Yeah.
lot of Taiwanese people feel.
Yeah.
They're living with this constant threat from China.
Makes sense.
But they're also wary of becoming too reliant on the U.S.
Oh, so they're kind of caught in the middle.
Exactly. Stuck between these two superpowers.
Mm-hmm. It must be hard to sort of navigate that.
It is. It's a complex situation,
Right.
and there's no single Taiwanese viewpoint.
Right.
The video has interviews with several Taiwanese citizens,
Okay.
and their perspectives are really all over the place.
So what are some of the things that they say?
Some of them see the U.S. as a protector,
Hmm.
a friend,
Yeah.
while others are more skeptical of U.S. involvement,
Right.
and some acknowledge the ties to mainland China.
Economically and culturally?
Exactly. But others really emphasize their distinct Taiwanese identity.
So there's a real mix of viewpoints.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It sounds like there's a desire for agency, though.
Yes.
For self-determination.
They want to control their own destiny.
Right, but they're stuck
Exactly.
between these two superpowers.
And this is where the ideological differences really come into play.
Okay.
Taiwan has embraced democracy
Right.
and capitalism, while China remains a one-party state with a more socialist system.
Right. Fundamentally different.
Yeah. And it complicates things even further.
For sure.
You brought up TSMC earlier.
Yeah.
The video mentions how China controlling that would give them this massive advantage
Oh, yeah.
in the global tech industry.
It's hard to overstate how important those chips are.
And if China had control over 90% of the production,
That would shift the balance of power.
oh, absolutely. It'd be a game changer.
Yeah. So it's not just about the territory.
Nope.
It's about ideology, economics, global power.
It's everything.
So is there any possibility for a peaceful resolution here?
Well, the video lays out a few scenarios.
Okay.
And none of them are particularly great.
Oh, boy.
One possibility is that things just stay the same,
Okay.
status quo. Both sides maintain their positions and try to avoid a conflict.
But that just sounds like kicking the can down the road.
It does, right? It's a powder keg just waiting to explode.
Yeah.
Any little misstep could trigger a crisis.
So what are some other possibilities?
Well, China could decide to up the pressure, maybe a naval blockade,
Oh,
or even a full-scale invasion.
and how would the U.S. respond to that?
Well, they've pledged to support Taiwan,
Right.
but they also don't want a war with a nuclear-armed China.
Yeah, nobody wants that.
It's a delicate balancing
It
act.
sounds like we're headed for a clash.
It does feel that way sometimes.
Is there any hope for diplomacy at this point?
While some experts believe that dialogue is the best way forward,
Okay.
but it would require both sides to, make some concessions,
Yeah.
which is hard with the current political climate.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It's tough to see either side backing down.
True.
But, diplomacy is about bridging those divides. It's
Yeah.
about finding common ground,
Yeah.
building trust.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners?
The most important thing is to understand that the Taiwan issue is incredibly complex.
Yeah.
There are no easy answers.
Right.
We can't oversimplify things.
We need to stay informed.
Yes.
Think critically about the information we're consuming.
Exactly. Don't just accept the headlines.
Yeah.
Dig deeper.
Go beyond the sound bites.
Exactly. Consider all the perspectives.
Because this isn't just about Taiwan.
Right.
This is about global peace and stability.
It's about the future.
It feels like we're at this crossroads, and no matter which way we go,
Yeah.
it could be dangerous.
It's tricky.
Is there any, historical precedent for this kind of situation? Or is this totally new territory?
It's interesting because while the situation with Taiwan is unique,
Okay.
history is full of these kinds of rivalries between major powers,
Oh, yeah.
especially over places that are strategically important.
Right, I'm thinking of the Cold War.
Exactly.
Or even the scramble for colonies back in the 1800s.
Those are all great examples.
So we're seeing a lot of the same things happening with Taiwan.
Yeah, that mix of political ideology, economic interests,
Yeah.
and just national pride.
It's all tangled up.
It is. So are there any lessons we can learn from the past?
That's a good question.
Like, what pitfalls should we be watching out for?
Yeah, because it feels like we're walking on eggshells.
Well, one thing history teaches us is that miscalculation can be really dangerous,
Oh, yeah.
especially when things are already tense.
Right.
Even small incidents can escalate quickly.
Like, what kinds of things are you thinking?
Well, think about the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
That started World War I, right?
Exactly.
Wow.
Or the Cuban Missile Crisis.
That was scary.
Oh my gosh, we were so close to nuclear war.
Yeah.
So in the context of Taiwan,
Yeah.
it could be a military exercise, a cyber attack,
Yeah.
even just an accident.
That could set things off.
Exactly. It makes you realize how fragile peace really is.
It does.
Another lesson from history, though,
Okay.
is how important communication and diplomacy are.
Even when it seems impossible.
Yeah, even then. Think about the Cold War.
Okay.
The U.S. and the Soviet Union hated each other,
Yeah.
but they still talked.
Okay.
They had these channels of communication.
To avoid blowing each other up.
Right. It wasn't easy, and there were some close calls.
Oh, I bet.
But diplomacy helped prevent a much bigger war.
So even though things seem really bad with Taiwan right now,
Yeah.
there's still hope that talking can help.
I think so. It's easy to just focus on the military stuff
Yeah.
and all the tough talk.
Right.
But there are people on both sides working behind the scenes
Okay.
to keep those lines of communication open.
That's good to know.
Yeah. And, they're looking for ways to de-escalate things.
So it's not all doom and gloom.
No. Diplomacy is a constant process,
Yeah, that makes sense.
even when things are really tense.
Okay, so we've talked about history and diplomacy,
Yeah.
but what about technology?
Ooh, good point.
How does that factor into all of this?
Well, that's a huge question.
Yeah.
And one we should be paying more attention to.
Yeah, how could things like AI,
Yeah.
autonomous weapons,
Mm-hmm.
cyber warfare...
All that stuff. It could make things a lot worse.
How so?
Well, just imagine AI systems making decisions about military action.
Without any humans involved.
Exactly.
That's kind of terrifying.
Or picture swarms of autonomous drones
Oh, wow.
carrying out these unpredictable attacks.
It sounds like something out of a movie.
I know, but it's becoming more and more real.
Okay, so that's the scary side of technology.
Yeah.
But could it also help?
Potentially, yes. What if we use technology for de-escalation?
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Imagine sophisticated simulations
Okay.
that could help leaders understand what might happen.
Before they actually do anything.
Exactly. Or secure communication platforms.
So they can talk without things getting lost in translation.
Yeah. So technology is a double-edged sword.
For sure.
It can make things better or worse.
So it really comes down to how we use it.
Exactly.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive.
It has.
We started by asking why Taiwan is such a geopolitical hotspot.
Right.
And we've uncovered all this history, ideology, economics, military strategy.
It's complicated.
It is.
But you know what's important to remember?
What's that?
This isn't just some abstract geopolitical thing.
Yeah.
It's about real people's lives.
Millions of them.
Exactly.
So as we keep following this story,
Yeah,
let's do it responsibly.
absolutely.
Let's try to understand all the sides.
Mm-hmm.
And let's hope for peaceful solutions.
I agree.
The stakes are just too high to ignore it.
Well said.
And that's it for today's deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic, so stay tuned.
All right, let's dive into something pretty intense, I guess you could say. China's maritime disputes. You know, it's one of those things in global politics that, well, it keeps a lot of people up at night. I mean, trying to grasp all the history and the economics, the military posturing. Luckily, we've got this amazing timeline. It's from the Council on Foreign Relations, and it covers, like, what, over a century of all this stuff happening in both the South China Sea and the East China Sea. Buckle up because, this is a wild ride. But I've got an expert with us today who's going to help connect the dots.
Oh, thanks for having me. I think you're right. These disputes, they're kind of like a slow-burning fuse. And if you really want to understand what's going on today, you got to dig into that history.
Yeah, I mean, just look at the geography. It's mind-blowing. We're talking the South China Sea, just a massive amount of trade routes, tons of resources, with all these countries around it, each one saying, hey, this part's mine. And then there's the East China Sea. Those Senkaku Islands, man, they've become like a symbol of, everything that's tense between China and Japan. But it's not just those two, right? You've got the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, even the U.S. getting tangled up in it all.
You're absolutely right. Lots of players, lots of overlapping claims, and a whole lot of history. That's, well, let's just say it doesn't make things any easier. Like you said, it's a crowded neighborhood. And our timeline, it actually takes us all the way back to 1895.
1895,
Right.
now.
The end of the Sino-Japanese War. And you'd think the Treaty of Shimonoseki would have cleared everything up. But nope, it actually made things worse, especially when it came to those Senkaku Islands.
Oh, how so?
The treaty was super vague about who actually owned them. So naturally, both China and Japan said, hey, they were ours first. And bam, you've got the beginning of decades of disputes.
A vague treaty, that seems, well, maybe not the best way to avoid future problems.
Exactly. It's like building a house on, I don't know, a swamp or something. It's not going to end well.
So not a stable foundation.
And then, of course, World War II comes along and throws everything into even more chaos. Japan's occupying islands in the South China Sea. The U.S. takes control of the Senkaku. Controls changing hands left and right.
Yeah, makes sense that it would get messy. So then we're in 1947, and China just throws down this 9-dash line on a map. Basically, they're claiming most of the South China Sea, including islands and waters that other countries say are theirs. I mean, was this a power move? Were they saying this is how it's going to be?
The 9-dash line, it's complicated. China really believes it just shows their historical rights. But the problem is it cuts right through some other countries' exclusive economic zones.
Wait, back up a sec. Exclusive economic zones. For the rest of us who don't speak, ocean law, what exactly does that mean?
Right, good point. Basically, an EEZ gives a country special rights over what happens in the water 200 nautical miles from their coast. They control the resources and stuff. So when you've got this 9-dash line cutting through those zones, well, you can imagine the conflicts.
Yeah, that's a recipe for trouble. So you've got this historical baggage, and then you throw in modern laws, and they just clash.
Exactly. And, the 9-dash line doesn't really fit in with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS either. That's the big rule book for all things ocean-related today.
Ah, okay, so China's playing by a different set of rules, it seems like.
Well, they believe their historical claims are just as valid. It's a tricky situation.
And it's all happening against the backdrop of the Cold War. That can't have helped, right?
No, definitely not. The Cold War made everything so much worse. You had all these alliances and rivalries, which just poured gasoline on the fire. Like, take the Sino-Vietnamese War in 1979. It just solidified this deep distrust between those two. They both ended up occupying parts of the Spratly Islands afterwards.
So more claims, more tension.
Then, in 1982, you've got unclos trying to bring some order to this chaos. But there are parts of unclos that are a little unclear, especially when it comes to, how to handle these old historical claims, and that unfortunately leaves the door open for things to keep going the way they were. More disputes.
Yeah, it feels like every attempt to fix things just makes them more complicated. And then, on top of all this, we had the discovery of oil and gas in the South China Sea.
Oh yeah, back in the 1970s.
Suddenly, these territorial squabbles are about something way more valuable, like a potential resource war.
That's right. And at the same time, China's economy is booming, growing like crazy.
So they need that oil and gas even more.
Exactly. They need more and more energy to keep that growth going. So controlling those resources in the South China Sea becomes even more important to them.
Okay, so we've got this Cold War tension simmering, the lure of oil and gas. It seems like everyone's heading for a collision, but was there any attempt to, like, cooperate at all during this time?
Actually, yeah, there were a few moments where things looked like they might go in a better direction. Like in 2008, China and Japan signed this agreement to jointly develop resources in the East China Sea.
Wow, that sounds promising.
Right. You'd think shared economic interests would bring them together, but
I have a bad feeling about this.
it didn't really work out. Despite all the shared interests, there was just too much distrust between them.
From all those years of arguing over the island.
Exactly. And all those old historical grievances, they just kept getting in the way. Made it impossible to really cooperate, even when it made sense economically.
So even when they had common ground, the past just kept pulling them apart.
It's a recurring theme, unfortunately.
So it's clear things were already pretty tense, but then things really start heating up in the late 80s and into the 90s, right?
You're exactly right. It's at that point that China really starts to, well, flex its muscles a bit more openly, let's say.
Okay, give me some examples.
Well, in 1988, there's the Johnson-South Reef clash. China actually sinks Vietnamese ships.
Whoa. That's a major escalation.
It really sent shockwaves through the whole region. Then in 1996, we've got the Mischief Reef incident with the Philippines. China ends up occupying a reef that the Philippines claimed as their own.
It seems like China's not messing around anymore. They're willing to use force, or at least the threat of it, to get what they want.
It was definitely a wake-up call for the region,
Mm-hmm.
especially for the Philippines. They realized that, hey, maybe just talking about cooperation wasn't going to cut it.
Yeah, no kidding. Actions speak louder than words, right?
Exactly. They started looking for stronger security guarantees. They turned to the U.S., because of that long-standing mutual defense treaty they have.
Makes sense. They needed a counterweight to China's growing power.
It was becoming clear that this was turning into a power struggle, and the U.S. might end up getting pulled in.
Okay, so the stage is set. We've got a real rivalry brewing. What happens next? Hashtag TTS, the Deep Dive episode 2024-1126, part 2 of 3.
So yeah, China's making some pretty bold moves in the South China Sea, and everyone's starting to get a little nervous.
Yeah, it was like the late 90s, and China was definitely sending a message, like, we're here and we're serious. Did that change how other countries acted? I mean, did anyone change their strategy because of that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the whole global situation was changing too, right? The Cold War was over, and China was, well, they were becoming a global superpower fast.
So they had more power to throw around, and they weren't afraid to use it.
Exactly. That economic growth, it gave them the resources to be more assertive. And that's exactly what they did in the South China Sea.
What about the U.S. during all this? Weren't they trying to, like, build a better relationship with China?
Yeah, that was the idea. In the late 90s and early 2000s, the U.S. was all about engagement with China.
So, like, working together more.
Right. They hoped that by, bringing China into the global system, things would be more stable. There were even agreements, like the 1998 Military Maritime Consultative Agreement. It was supposed to prevent misunderstandings and reduce the risk of, things getting out of hand at sea.
Sounds like a good idea.
But at the same time, the U.S. kept doing those freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea.
You mean sailing warships near those islands that China was building?
Exactly. They wanted to challenge those Chinese claims and show that those waters were international, not just China's backyard.
It seems a little contradictory, right? Trying to be friends with China, but also challenging them like that? Did it work?
It's a tough question. It's hard to say for sure. I mean, that U.S. engagement policy, it did help China's economy grow, which of course gave them even more resources to build up their military.
Ah, the law of unintended consequences.
Right. And those freedom of navigation operations, they really ticked off China.
Right.
China saw it as like a direct challenge to their sovereignty. So yeah, a lot of tension there.
Always a risk of things boiling over.
Yeah, always.
So it's this constant back and forth with the potential for things to go really wrong. And then you have new leaders coming onto the scene, adding even more complexity. In the Philippines, you've got President Duterte taking office in 2016. He seemed to try a different approach with China.
Right. Duterte was definitely a different kind of leader. He didn't focus so much on those territorial disputes. He was more interested in, getting along with China, building economic ties.
A little more pragmatic, maybe.
Yeah, you could say that. He even banned fishing in the Scarborough Shoal, as a goodwill gesture to China. He figured that if they worked together on economics, China would be less aggressive.
So a little bit of a gamble, hoping for a better outcome through cooperation. Did it pay off?
I mean, things did calm down a bit, at least for a while. But the real problems, those didn't go away. The Philippines still claimed those territories, and China wasn't backing down from their claims either.
Just kicking the can down the road, basically.
Pretty much. A temporary fix, but the potential for conflict was still there.
What about the other countries in the region? How did they feel about Duterte being so friendly with China?
It was mixed. Some, like Vietnam, were really skeptical. They worried that it would just make China bolder, more likely to push around other countries in the South China Sea. Others thought it was the right move, given how powerful China was becoming.
A lot of different opinions, then.
Yeah, it was a complicated situation.
Yeah.
But one thing everyone agreed on, it was still a very volatile situation.
Like walking on eggshells.
Exactly. One wrong step, and things could blow up. And then, in December 2016, something happens that really shows how quickly things can get out of control. That Chinese warship seizing a U.S. underwater drone.
Right. That was a big deal. I remember that.
Yeah, the drone was just gathering scientific data, but China took it anyway. They gave it back eventually, but it was a big wake-up call.
Like, hey, we're not playing around.
Exactly. It showed that even something small could turn into a major international incident. The distrust between the U.S. and China, it was still very real.
It's like they're playing this high-stakes game, and no one wants to blink first.
That's a good way to put it. And it wasn't just the South China Sea. The East China Sea was still a problem, too.
Oh, right. What happened there?
Well, in 2018, there was a huge oil spill in the East China Sea. An oil tanker and a cargo ship collided.
Yikes. That's bad.
It was a disaster. And it happened right in the middle of those disputed waters, so you can imagine how complicated the cleanup and everything became.
So it's not just about politics and territory. It affects the environment, too. Real-world consequences.
For sure. But even with all this tension, there were still some attempts to, manage the risks and try to prevent things from escalating. Like in 2018, China and Japan set up a hotline.
A hotline, like so they could call each other directly.
Yeah, it was supposed to help prevent accidents at sea and in the air. A small step, but at least it was something.
Okay, so some glimmers of hope amidst all the tension. But I can't help but feel like things are about to take a turn for the worse again.
You're right to be worried. Because as we move into the late 2010s, a new player enters the scene. Someone who would really change China's foreign policy. President Xi Jinping.
Xi Jinping. Yeah, his rise to power was definitely a turning point.
Absolutely. He had this vision of China as a rejuvenated nation, more powerful, more assertive on the world stage. And that definitely had an impact on the South China Sea.
It sounds like things are about to get a lot more intense.
You could say that. Under Xi Jinping, China became even more forceful in the South China Sea. They started sending bombers to those artificial islands, the ones they'd built. It was a clear signal to the U.S. and to everyone else that China was done playing a passive role.
So things are heating up. Were there any specific incidents during this time that were especially worrying?
Yeah, there were a few. In 2019, for instance, China sent a survey ship to operate within Vietnam's exclusive economic zone near one of their offshore oil fields.
It's pretty provocative.
It was definitely a power move. China was showing they weren't afraid to use their navy to pressure their neighbors and claim those resources.
And then 2020 arrives, and the whole world is thrown into chaos with the COVID-19 pandemic. Did that have any effect on the situation in the South China Sea?
It did, and maybe not in the way you'd expect.
Yeah.
While everyone else was focused on dealing with the pandemic, China saw it as an opportunity.
To take advantage of the situation.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
They ramped up their activities in the South China Sea. They built new research stations on those artificial islands, harassed Vietnamese fishing boats, even aimed their weapons at a Philippine naval vessel.
Wow, that's taking advantage of a crisis.
It was a pretty aggressive move, and it showed that even a global pandemic wasn't going to stop China from pursuing their goals in the South China Sea.
It's scary how these rivalries just keep going no matter what else is happening in the world. So we've got China becoming more and more bold. Duterte's attempt at appeasement isn't really working, and the U.S. is stuck trying to figure out how to respond. What was the rest of the world doing during all this?
Well, as China became more aggressive, other countries started to speak up. Even countries that hadn't been that involved before, like France, Germany, the UK, they started expressing concerns about what China was doing.
So it wasn't just a regional issue anymore.
Right, it was becoming a global problem. They all supported that 2016 ruling that basically said China's 9-line claim was bogus. It was a sign that more and more countries were seeing China's actions as a threat to, the way things were supposed to work in the world.
And what about the U.S.? Did they change their strategy at all?
Oh, yeah. Under both Trump and Biden, the U.S. took a much tougher stance on China. They increased their military presence in the region, did more of those freedom of navigation operations, and strengthened alliances with countries like Japan, Australia, and India.
So they were drawing a line in the sand, basically.
Exactly. The message was clear. The U.S. wasn't going to let China just take over the South China Sea.
So everyone's taking sides, the tension is building, and it feels like we're on the edge of a major confrontation. What happens next?
Hashtag TTS, the Deep Dive episode 2024-11-26, part 3 of 3.
Yeah, the 2020s, things in the South China Sea, it's like, well, imagine a pod about to boil over. That's what it felt like. The tension was crazy high.
We've got China doing its thing, the U.S. pushing back, and countries like the Philippines caught right in the middle. It's a recipe for, well, something bad, right? What were some of those key moments that really got us to this point?
Well, 2021, there's this big standoff at Whitsun Reef. That's inside the Philippines EEZ, by the way. Hundreds of Chinese ships, most of them probably part of their maritime militia, they just swarmed the reef.
Hold on, maritime militia, what's that?
Oh, it's basically like, well, they're fishing boats, but not really.
Like a disguise.
Yeah, it's China's way of flexing their muscles without actually sending in the Navy. They use these fishing boats to, intimidate other countries and control those waters. So it's not just about sending in warships. It's this sneaky way of pushing boundaries and seeing what they can get away with.
Exactly. And for countries like the Philippines, it's a nightmare. They're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
They can't afford to make China angry. Right.
Right. They need China economically, but they also need to protect their own territory. It's a tough balancing act.
David versus Goliath, but in real life. Did anyone manage to stand up to China during all this?
Actually, yeah. End of 2022, something really interesting happens. Indonesia and Vietnam, they finally figured out the borders of their EEZs in the South China Sea.
So they worked it out between themselves.
Yeah, after years of talking, they came to an agreement. And you know what? It directly challenged China's 9-line because it overlapped with both their EEZs.
So a direct hit to China's claims. How did they take it?
Not well. In August 2023, China releases a new map, and guess what? They added another dash.
A 10-dash line?
Yep. It pushed their claim even further into everyone else's territory. The whole world basically told them to knock it off.
Sounds like a giant middle finger to the international community.
It definitely raised the stakes. China was showing they were serious, and they weren't backing down.
Okay, 2024. Things are getting really intense now. What happened next?
Well, early 2024, there's a ton of military activity in the South China Sea. The U.S. wanted to show their allies they had their back, so they actually sent more troops to the Philippines. They got access to 4 more bases there.
So the U.S. is putting their money where their mouth is?
Exactly. They're showing China they mean business.
Oh.
China wasn't happy about it, of course, but it definitely strengthened the U.S.-Philippines relationship.
But did it actually stop China from doing what they wanted?
Hard to say. But it didn't exactly calm things down either. April 2024, the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines held this big summit. They basically said they're going to work together to protect freedom of navigation and all that, and they criticized China's actions.
A united front, huh?
Yep. And then, get this, they held joint naval patrols. U.S., Australia, Japan, and the Philippines, all sailing together in the South China Sea.
That's like a major show of force.
It was definitely meant to send a message, but it didn't work. Actually, it might have made things worse. June 2024, there's a confrontation near the Second Thomas Shoal.
Another flashpoint. What happened this time?
Chinese Coast Guard ships, they rammed into Philippine Navy boats, threatened their crews too. It was a mess. The Philippines were furious, and the U.S. said, hey, we're going to defend you. It almost turned into a war.
A hat close to war.
It was pretty scary. Luckily, things didn't go that far. In July, China and the Philippines managed to agree to calm things down and set up a hotline to communicate.
So a truce for now.
Kind of, but the agreement's not very clear. and it seems like each side thinks it means something different. The problems are still there, and there's still a chance things could flare up again.
So much uncertainty.
Yeah, it's like, well, these disputes aren't just about little islands or even oil and gas anymore. They're about power.
Right.
China wants to be the big dog in the region, and the U.S. wants to make sure that doesn't happen.
It's like this huge power struggle playing out on the world stage.
Exactly. And it's not going away anytime soon.
So, are we doomed to fight over this forever? Or is there a way out of this mess?
That's the question, isn't it? There's no easy answer. But if we want to avoid a war, diplomacy is key. Countries need to talk to each other, find compromises, and try to build some trust. It's a long shot, but it's the best shot we've got.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. It's been a wild ride through history, economics, and military maneuvers. We started with a little argument over some islands back in 1895, and now it's this huge, complex issue that's affecting the whole world. It really makes you think about where we're headed in the future. We've just scratched the surface here, but I hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of all the different pieces of this puzzle. The history, the players, and what's at stake. We'll be sure to include links to all that great information from the Council on Foreign Relations and some other resources in the show notes. I really encourage you to keep learning about this, explore the different viewpoints, and think about what it all means for the future. Because this is a story that's still unfolding, and it's one that affects all of us. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.